Congratulations to the whole class of 2025. It's an impressive group, and that includes Bruce Cohen. And it's my honor to induct him here tonight. In preparation for this job, I received a copy from Bonesy of a report on the 1977 Spring Sizzler. The very first sentence of that report reads, Richie Evans was slurping steamers and beer with Bruce Cohen and his band of Bostonians. There's not another word in that story about Bruce Cohen or why in the hell he belonged in the first sentence of the report. The race was won by Maynard Troyer, by the way. Truth of the matter is, even back then, Bruce Cohen had his fingerprints all over this sport. Mentioning more than his name was not needed. The writer, for instance, didn't have to point out that Bruce was part of the trio, along with Dick Berggren and Lou Boyd, that brought the then revolutionary Spring Sizzler to Stafford. That story is now more than history. It's racing folklore. It's the stuff of legend in New England. But there's more. The night before that first Sizzler, Bruce Cohen was looking down the length of a loaded pistol at Jackie Arut. And it makes sense. Who else you going to put in the Stafford office with a loaded gun charged with protecting the Spring Sizzler purse money? Had to be Bruce. Who else? There are just so many Bruce stories. Stories he tells and stories we tell about him. 6 decades going back to his schoolboy days and 2 phases that included fan, writer, radio personality, car owner, promoter, consultant. There's a ton of them. There's comical stories, like that nude photo in Stock Car magazine, like that barber's chair that now sits in the Pro9 Museum, and his role as Lenny Bowler's haberdasher. The Cohen Bowler story is a gem. And it actually began with Bowler coming to Bruce's rescue on the highway when the truck Bruce was driving broke down. And there's stories of more significance, like his contribution to the organization that honors him today. He was a vital force in getting this organization off the ground. I can testify to that. I watched it. There was a special bond between him and Al Feeney. The Lou Boyd here is kind of like the treasure house of Bruce Cohen stories, the result of countless miles these two traveled around the racetracks throughout the Northeast. Ask Lou about Hannibal's elephants on the Mass Pike, the hallucinations that came up from too many miles of driving, too many late nights. Not only did Bruce know everybody everywhere, Boyd will tell you, that almost everywhere they went, there were people ready to help them out. Boyd's rendition of the Bowler story, for instance, ends with a victory at Lakeville. The Bible tells us, whatever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. I can testify to more than one incident of Bruce Cohen coming to his friend's aid. I have to believe there are more stories like that. Stories that Bruce doesn't necessarily tell, stories that are between Bruce and the individual or the individuals. No question, there's absolutely no question, Bruce knows when to show his cards when he thinks the time is right for that. He's not a guy to hide opinions. But Bruce also knows when to hold his cards, when to not show them. And I personally believe he has as many friends because of that as he does for the stories we all tell about him. Ethan, Nathaniel, Ariana, his grandchildren are here tonight. And I want to tell you, you have a very, very special grandfather. It is with great joy that I welcome my friend Bruce Cohen into the New England Auto Racers Hall of Fame.
I would like to thank Near for this great honor. And I'd like to start to say that this 60-odd year journey is all about the people I met. And that's, what more can you say? They're some of the most wonderful people in the world. And it started for me, I grew up in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, 2 blocks from Route 1, and take a left and 6 miles from the Norwood Arena. I could never get there as a young kid, but I'd be riding my bike down the street, and I'd take a left and a right, and there were these 2 race cars, these really colorful race cars, parked in a driveway. It turned out they were owned by Ed Gendro Sr., who promoted Norwood before NASCAR, and they were driven by Bob Harper and Leo Cleary. We moved to Brookline, which to me was a complete waste of time, and after 2 years in Brookline High, we parted ways. So my parents, figuring, well, we got to make something out of this character, enrolled me at the new preparatory school in Brookline. And there, who do I meet? A guy named Butch Walsh, Bobby Rifton. His dad was M&H Tire. This guy made racing tires, and it was really cool. And I also met Skinny Phil Sears, whose best friend was a kid named Don McTavish, who was running the C division over the ramps every 3rd lap at Norwood. I was done. That was it. I was hooked. Liberation Day came for me when I got my driver's license, and that was wow. I had an 11:30 curfew, but if I asked my parents, could I go to Lowell Bridge Stadium, I'd take the car. It was really bizarre, but it was a lot of fun. And I started going to Norwood, and I sat up high in the second turn and watched Wild Bill Slater, Steady Eddie Flemke, Red Foot, Smokey Boutwell, the Red Devil, Barney Matty, Joe McNulty, and many others in these colorful race cars, which to me were kind of an outlaw thing, considering my background and where I came from. It was a wonderful time. I started going in the pits, and then I met a bunch of people who had race cars 5 miles away in Needham Gasoline Alley. So I started visiting them, and it was like got to meet a lot of people. Pete Hamilton, Don McTavish, Bobby Melnick, Bobby Bakioki, Jack Malone. And I can't say I was a peer of theirs, I was a contemporary of theirs. I did not drive race cars. I did not have the ability or the temperament. So I started writing in '63 when Illustrated Speedway News had a contest, and I won a couple of them. And one night, I was at Old Bridge Stadium, and I was talking to Fats Caruso, and a fellow named Len Sammons was publishing this fairly new Avia Auto Racing News came up to us. I said, Mr. Sammons, that was not the way that race at Norwood ran the way you had it in your newspaper. And Fats says, that's for sure. So Len said to me, why don't you start writing? So I started writing my version of what happened at Norwood on a Saturday night. And Carl Merrill, who I had the most honest relationship in the world, we hated each other. And there's nothing wrong with that. They started publishing what I wrote. And so I wrote for Len Sammons for a few years. And then came basic training down in beautiful Fort Jackson, South Carolina, that I went through basic training with, believe it or not, Jim Croce, who wrote the song Bad, Bad Leroy Brown, which, according to the book, They Raced with a Devil, was not the right way Jim started in racing. We used to go on Thursday nights to the new Columbia Speedway in Columbia, and there was a guy named Leroy Yarbrough running. That's where that came from. And then after I got back, I moved to Chris Economaki National Speedway News, where I wrote until the mid-'70s, and that was a lot of fun. When Earl Grant gave the halfway sign with the flags, and I said, wow, we actually pulled this thing off. And the third highlight was the next day when Bill Slater had me clean the ladies' room and the men's room. So it all isn't glory, but I want to thank Jack LaRoute, may he rest in peace, and Dick and Lou and Jimmy Rigney and R.A. and Corky Cookman, people besides Billy Welch, people behind the scenes were really good to us. And that was a lot of fun. Thank you. And so we did that, and then as a little kid, a young man, I went to Fonda Speedway, and I just fell in love with the place. Lou and I started running Fonda in '73. At the same time, Ken Squire, who we all know and love, asked me if I could help him do a show at the Pocono, as you'd be his background guy, and I said, okay. So we go up and do the show, and if anyone remembers the Race of Champions, I'm sure Bob Garbarino does, and Denny Zimmerman and other people, those scorers could screw up a one-car race in a closed paper bag. Totally incompetent. So Kenny says to me, he's closing down the broadcast, he says, Bruce, he said, tell me, you were scoring the race, can I have your top 8? I said, yeah. So I scored it, I had my top 8, and so Kenny says, this is Bruce Cohen's top 8. It is not official, but we got to close the broadcast and the show. I said, oh, that was cool. So we did. I'm at work the next morning. I get a phone call at 7 in the morning. It's Kenny. He said, how'd you do it? I said, what do I do now? He said, you got it perfectly. I said, well, I learned from 2 of the best in the business. Shirley Jackman, who was Bill Welch's longtime girlfriend, and from Betty Charland. And let me tell you something, folks. I could get you 1 lap in 75. No problem. But so Kenny says, why don't you go with me and do TV, blah, 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 blah. I said, Kenny, my bit in life ever since I've been a little kid is racing at Fonda. That's all I want to do. Lou and I are doing it. I'm having the time of my life. I'm probably the only human being who ever turned Ken Squire down. I could have been a big star, but I would make the same decision today, and I stand by that. And that was a lot of fun. And then Lou, after this Fonda bit, Lou and I, we ran all over the place. Canaan, Hudson, Lakeville, just everywhere. And that was a lot of fun. And then the night before, I did sleep on the floor with $13,000 and a gun. And Jackie came up, and I could have shot him, but I didn't. But Jackie says, a lot of people wish you would have shot me, but we love Jack. And that was a lot of fun. And the Sizzler, I am so proud of Stafford today that it's still going. I think that's a tribute to the racing people. And like I said, for me, it's about the racing people. I'd also like to take a time for my family, my daughters and son-in-laws and grandkids who are here. I'd also like to shout out to Jimmy Lenardi and Hope Cooper, who were here, and Steve and Joanne Bosley from the famed L&R Speed Shop that people might remember in the day. And my buddy Jerry Feldman, that we used to go to Stafford in the early 60s when it was dirt. The next part of my, I don't want to say career, of my fun was doing Speedline with John Spence, the Hall of Fame member. 2-hour show, Tuesday nights, in various places around the New Hampshire area. And thank God we had a 7-second delay, because sometimes you had to hit it when people would get a little crazy. And a couple of things from Speedline is we used to have the Rumor of the Week department, and we also had the Missing Persons department, that if we couldn't find so-and-so by the end of the broadcast, we'd call up Woods and put their picture in a milk carton. But that worked. But I think the greatest thing of Speedline was we used to poke fun at Val and Speedway scene. We used to say, Speedline scoops the scene. A big thing back in those days was, would Bob Bear get a cup date? And we had an extensive spy network. And one of our spies calls and says, hey, Bob Bear has just booked every room in the Manchester, Concord, and Nashua area. And we're going, we looked at the calendar. There's nothing going on. He's got the date. And so I called Dick the next morning and said, Dick, I said, this is when Bear's date is. And he said, he said, okay. He calls me back 10 minutes later. I called Bob. Bob was at the bank. Bob says, nowhere. No way. And I said, Bob Bear crosses every T and dots every I. I said, go to the bank on it, little pun intended. And the next day they announced, big press conference in Boston. Bob had the date. So once again, Speedline scooped the scene. And part of the fun, around Christmas, it was just a dead time of the year. Like, oh man, we got 2 hours. How are we going to do this bit? And I'm looking at John. I says, hey, John, I got an idea. So my best radio voice, you got to project your voice. I said, okay, ladies and gentlemen, and Speedline listeners, everybody has your favorite driver. Who is the worst driver you've ever seen? the phones almost blew up from activity. It was unbelievable. And one caller said, the worst driver I've ever seen is Herbie Simpson. And I said, yeah, I'd go along with that. He cold-cocked me one day at Hudson. But we turned a dead show into something really live. And Speedway was fun. And we had stickers made up. We put on Val's wagon and everything, Speedline scoops the thing. But that was a lot of fun, too, Speedline. And we had some great guests. Dick Bergman, Lou was on. And I just want to say a word about Lou. He's just put up with me for 60-odd years. Many highway miles, lots of work, lots of fun. And it is true, when we used to come back from Fonda, going over the bridge, the Connecticut River, and the Mass Pike, he would get the pink elephant syndrome. And he'd wake me up. I'm seeing pink elephants. You got to drive home. And I always did. And speaking, there's a guy right here, Jimmy Falcone. He actually worked at the Spring Sizzler as a guard. And how many years ago, Jimmy? 53? Yeah. A long time ago. Yeah, and I'd also like to call out, I don't think he's here today. My next thing was being really busy with NEAR. I was lucky enough to be appointed to being the chair of the selection committee. I work with great people, Charlie Mitchell, Pete Zanardi. A guy who's never gotten enough credit for helping this club was Al Feeney. Al kept this thing going. Al and I had some wonderful disagreements, but at the end, we always reached a conclusion, and I love Al for that. And I'm very proud of what we did in NEAR. We inducted the first woman, Bertha Small, who owned a lot of race cars back in the day, and we spent a lot of time on the inductions, who would be good for who. And one of the ones that we came up with was having Kenny Bouchard's daughter, Olivia, induct him. And I thought that was a really cool moment. And it was a lot of fun working with NEAR. And another shout out to NEAR. A NEAR member is R.A. Sylvia. He has contributed so much to this club. When they need pictures, when they need info, R.A.'s always been the man. And he's just a great guy. And I just want to conclude that I was privy to a lot of stories, but this to me, what racing people is all about. Don McTavish and I were very good friends on and off the track. When Don was getting inducted, Al Feeney calls me, he says, hey, you got to get a, she says, you know where Mac's sister is? I said, she's down the Cape somewhere. I haven't heard from her in years. Well, you got to find her and invite her. And I go, oh, I really don't want to. I said, do I have to do this? Yeah, you got to do it. So I got a hold of a phone number from Jack Malone. And I got the phone number. I said, oh, man, do I really got to do this? I said, yeah, I got to. Okay, so I did it. So I called up, hi, I'm looking for Marcia Sayer. That was her married name. She said, this is Marcia. So I said, Marcia, this is a voice out of your past. She says, Bruce, how the heck are you? I said, good. And I said, Marcia, I got something to run by you. I said, NEAR and a bunch of Donnie's friends, he's being inducted. We would like you and your family to attend. And I said, if you don't want to, it's perfectly understandable. She said, well, my boys are looking into his career. We would love to come there. I went, phew, problem solved. Next problem I came up, I said to myself, who should be there? George Caldwell. I don't know, some of you, Bobby Garbarino, some of you people have been around for 100 years like me might remember George. Well, George worked for Mac, then he did a little stint with Cookie and some with Richie. He moved south. If you watched in the 70s and 80s, Richard Petty getting gas, that was George pulling it in. He also drove the haul truck. So I figured, I'll call Petty Enterprises to speak to George. So I called Petty Enterprises. Hi, good afternoon, Petty Enterprises. May I help you? She said, yes, I'd like to speak to George Caldwell. Let me put you on hold. Then it's, why do you want to speak to him? I felt like saying a few words, but I didn't. I said, well, I got something of a personal nature to talk to him. She said, wait a minute. And she said, well, what is it? And I told her the story, what was going on. I said, look, I don't want to waste your time. I don't want you to waste my time, et cetera, et cetera. Here's my phone number. Give it to George, and if George wants, he'll call me. She said, wait a minute. 5 minutes later, he'll call you in 10 minutes. I said, cool. 10 minutes later, the phone rings. It's George. We're talking. He said, look. He said, I am in the hospital with stage 5 cancer. I got about a couple weeks to live. I will be there if I have to crawl on my hands and knees. I go, wow. Well, George and his family, his wife and son, the Petties, at their expense during Daytona Speed Week's practice, flew George and his family up to Bradley. The crew picked him up. There was a lot of hugs and kisses and old stories and everything about, George. And we inducted Donnie, and George went back to North Carolina. 4 days later, he was gone. The Petties were never looking for any kudos or thanks or recognition. And to me, what they did, that's what racing's about. And to me, it's about the people that I've met along the way. Someone like Eddie Flemke, who, everybody mentions Eddie. In my humble opinion, Eddie's accomplishments off the track were just as significant as his on-the-track accomplishments. Look at the people he mentored. One is here today. Denny Zimmerman, Pete Hamilton, Richie Evans. It goes on and on. And like I said, I will conclude by saying, it's been a wonderful ride and a wonderful journey, and thank you.